Good afternoon and welcome to this event on global democracy and the coronavirus fallout. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm the director of Carnegie Europe, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this discussion. We have with us Stefano Sannino, who is the Deputy Secretary General for Economic and Global Issues at the European External Action Service here in Brussels. We have Per Olsson Fridh, who is State Secretary to the Minister for International Development Cooperation of Sweden, and Juvonen, who is the Executive Director of Demo Finland, Political Parties of Finland for Democracy. And well, we have plenty of reasons actually for organising this event. First of all, it marks the launch of the International Democracy Week, which is starting today, and there'll be several events during the week. And secondly, it is also an opportunity to launch a collective report on global democracy and COVID-19, upgrading international support, which is co-authored by my colleague Richard Youngs and Elene Panchulidze of the Georgian Institute of Politics, but it's actually the work of 11 organizations led by the European Endowment for Democracy. So it's quite it's a real global look at what is happening around the world on democracy in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. I also would like to thank several organizations that are involved, both in the International Democracy Week and in co-organizing this event with us: the European Partnership for Democracy, International IDEA, the European Partnership for Democracy, European Endowment for Democracy, the European Network of Political Foundations, and last but not least, of course, the European Parliament for their support. So the discussion today will be based on, will be inspired, shall we say, from the findings of this report. But I'd like to also hear from all our speakers their perspectives, institutional perspectives, and their work experience on prospects for international support for democracy in this context. Before I frame this discussion, let me just give some practical points, some practical pieces of information. We will take up 45 minutes perhaps of our time with our presentations and initial discussion, and then we'd really like to open up to the audience. We know many of you, very knowledgeable partners and practitioners, you will be wanting to join with questions and with comments, and you can do so by writing your question on the YouTube chat or by tweeting us at Carnegie Europe, and you can use the hashtag Democracy Week 2020. So that's the practical information that you need to know. Let's start our discussion. So it goes without saying that this report is timely. The coronavirus pandemic has been an opportunity for some authoritarian leaders or semi-authoritarian leaders to tighten their grip on the populations, but we've also seen a new democratic momentum taking place in several countries. So there's been this discussion from the beginning of the pandemic as to whether democracies or authoritarian states are better placed for fighting the pandemic, and the report shows that it's actually a misguided question. The dynamics are such that we have stories of best practices on both ends of the spectrum and quite a lot in between. So we need to think differently about ascertaining the impact of coronavirus on democracy. So what was done in this report is to look at the nature of the threats to democracy and the types of opportunities that have emerged, with the goal of identifying some features that can help in dealing with the coronavirus. And then from there, what lessons can be found for international policies. So starting from the threats, we have seen, and the report really does a global tour, we've seen episodes, more or less systematic episodes of excessive use of violence by security forces. We've seen this in the Philippines, in South Africa, in other African countries as well, in Latin America, in the United States. We've seen instances of postponing elections, which of course, in resilient democracies, it might be accepted, but in other cases, it can be exploited as an opportunity to postpone elections indefinitely. And the report researchers measured 106 postponements in 61 countries, which was actually quite a shocking statistic, even for me. We've seen a clampdown on political opposition notorious cases, of course, is Hong Kong, but also Venezuela, Turkey, and many instances around the world in many countries where one might not expect this to happen. Plenty of media censorship, where critics of government responses to coronavirus get branded as fake news spreaders, disinformation, of course, misuse of digital surveillance, the whole debate on contact tracing apps, minority rights have been put into question, including in advanced democracies. But we've also seen counter trends that are really quite, in some cases, very evident. We've seen plenty of evidence of community support, volunteerism growing in several countries. We've seen that governments and institutions have become a bit more savvy about pushing back on disinformation. We've seen political opposition movements being strengthened. We've seen new protest movements coming out despite the restrictions. And a lot of online activity has also taken place. So we really are seeing a mixed picture. And if we want to find some common features in this, to understand what works in fighting the coronavirus pandemic and moving out of this sort of authoritarian versus democracy framing, we find that there's several features have emerged so far. One is trust. And by trust, we mean trust within communities as much as trust in the authorities. And this is not unique to democracies. Transparency of information is extremely important. We've seen that the most successful cases so far have seen women as leaders, which suggests that gender-sensitive policies and inclusivity are key features for successful responses. And finally, it's been very important for citizens to have accountability and oversight on government activity. This pertains not just to health issues, but also to how governments are responding and will continue to respond to the economic and social impact of the pandemic. So what does this mean for international support? We've seen that over the past few months, in fact, rather quickly, many governments put together aid packages that would support third countries in addressing the pandemic. And Stefano will tell us a lot more about this from the EU perspective. Of course, the United Nations and international organizations are also playing a part here alongside national governments. But they have been redirecting a lot of external assistance funding towards health related issues. And we can expect that looking forward, the economics and social issues will also become important. So how does this square with democracy support? Can we expect any changes? How is this going to work? Similarly, on the economic recovery, it's very important to ensure accountability, anti-corruption, oversight of decision making, and how to balance the goal of strengthening state infrastructure to make it more capable to address health problems, for instance, with preventing state capture. So I think these are some of the questions that the report tries to address. It also has some recommendations. Maybe we can go back to them at the very end. But I'd like to turn our attention now to our speakers and give them the opportunity to share their ideas. And let's start with Stefano, who is at the External Action Service, and among those who've been working to put together this Team Europe package, which mobilized 36 billion euros for the global response to the pandemic. I think the EU stands out here. I guess, you know, there's a sort of leadership issue on this matter from the US. So I think the EU is standing out a little bit more in this sense. And the initiative Team Europe aims to build back better. So it's looking at promoting equitable, sustainable, and inclusive recovery. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, Stefano? Can you give us a bit of meat on how this works and what the prospects are?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosa, and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Maybe while I was listening to your introductory remarks, I would like to start with very few quick points. The first one that you have somehow hinted, certainly the COVID-19 has been a sort of accelerator of trends, both positive and negative. And we have seen both of them working at the same time. The second point is that, as you said, there has been the element of the information, sometimes of the misuse of the information, has been also a very central element in all this story. And we have spoken about the High Representative has spoken a few times about the infodemic and the fact that there is a problem that has been, let's say, a layer added to the ones that was already generated by the crisis, which I think that we need to take into account. One element that I would also like to highlight is the challenge that we are living to multilateralism. Now, I'm not speaking only about, let's say, the United States being, let's say, less involved into multilateral processes, but let's say it has been quite evident that in a moment when we would have needed more multilateral responses to a number of crises, we have gone national, and we have, let's say, rather had an introvert reply to a response to what was happening. And the other point which I wanted to highlight is the issue of inequalities, because this crisis is also, let's say, heightening a number of inequalities. I'm speaking about all these elements because somehow these are part of the reasoning that has been behind the work that we have been doing on the Team Europe initiatives, in the sense that we wanted to provide an answer which would not be, which first of all would help decreasing the negative trend in a number of countries, especially those, let's say, closer to us, but not necessarily, that would reply also to the, let's say, to information battle, to the battle of the narratives that was taking place, so to develop our own positive narrative based on solidarity and cooperation. That would have been multilateral, coming from the European Union, and that would address somehow the issues of inequalities. So, as you mentioned before, what we have done is essentially with the money that were already existing. We have to be clear on this, that it's, I would say, a sort of redefinition, reorientation of money already been allocated to the countries. We have tried to respond to a number of problems that were coming up. First of all, the health and the humanitarian crisis, then the water and sanitation and nutrition problem that was coming up. And finally, the need to support the socioeconomic recovery of these countries, of the let's say the countries with which we were cooperating. So that has been the bottom line, and we have managed to identify within the budget 36 billions that we have redirected towards this, let's say, these needs. One thing which is important, I know that is well known, but I mean it's useful to repeat it, that essentially these projects had the and these initiatives had the ambition to be a catalyst also for support and assistance which would come from member states. So we wanted to join forces, not only with the money coming from European institutions, but also with the funds that were coming from member states, in order to be to have a greater impact and to let's say see if this could have a transformational effect over the countries, let's say, targeted by our assistance. If this has been the basis, let's say, of the first reaction and of the Team Europe package, which has been put in place alongside with a number of other initiatives, but I'm not dwelling on this. Certainly, what we have found is that the idea was positive, that was creating a sort of critical mass which could have had a positive impact on these countries. And then we have, let's say, elaborated even further on this idea, and we have said if we can help and support countries in this specific moment, maybe we can help them also to build back their own economies, to create the conditions for, let's say, a better health and environment. And why don't we do this in a way which is also in line with the European agenda that we are fostering and that we are promoting? So why don't we try to look also at initiatives about the digital transformation, or initiative concerning the climate change? There was an interesting reflection that I would say that has been made about the fact that if the development of the African countries is going to be financed through oil or other fossil energies, that would create an enormous problem to the whole package that we are trying to develop when it comes to climate change. So, I mean, we have tried to identify job creation or connectivity. So we have tried to identify a number of projects. I have to say that we are still in the process. It's because we have asked our delegation to come up with the specific suggestions on different initiatives at country level and at regional level as well. And it's very timely discussion that we are having today, because this morning I had co-chaired together with the Director General of DEFCO the first meeting on the Team Europe initiatives, together with all our delegations in Africa. And tomorrow we are doing the same with Latin America in the morning, in Asia in the morning and Latin America in the afternoon, in order to complete the picture and get a sense of which kind of initiatives could really have an impact, able to provide a transformation on the ground, be in line with our objectives and with the European agenda, and that could be, let's say, attractive also for member states to join in. This does not mean that, how to say, they have to put, member states have to put all the money into our pot, but let's say we can, if they want, we are more than happy to work together with them. But otherwise, we can certainly try to, let's say, to act in a very coordinated way in order to have a much greater impact. So from that point of view, we still do not have a clear figure of how much this is going to mean in terms of impact, but certainly it will be a very qualifying element of the new instrument for development cooperation that will come into life as from January next year. So that's more or less in a nutshell what we are doing under the headings of the Team Europe initiative, and the impact that we hope to have when we say to build back better, to in order to help these countries to recover, but also to move towards a much more sustainable pattern of growth.
Thank you very much, Stefano. It's good to know, we had it live, that you're actually meeting with, you know, all the delegations in the fields to figure out what are the best projects for the particular local context. Per, I'd like to turn to you now. Stefano said something which I think is interesting about making sure that the funding goes towards looking at a sustainable future. And I'd like to ask you about Sweden, its own democracy, and coronavirus. So we know Sweden received a lot of attention in the media because it went a separate path to the rest of Europe. We also know, and this emerges also in the report that was prepared, that democracies tend to score lower on pandemic deaths, but better on health and human development indicators. So the question really is, and of course, Sweden tops, you know, the top 10 league of democracies in terms of quality of democracy at global level. So what is it about Sweden's conception of democracy and health that works? Why did it choose a different path compared to other member states? And how is this going to be reflected in Sweden's international response, given again that Sweden is an important donor in democracy, on democracy matters.
Thank you very much, Rosa, and to all the parties who's been involved in arranging this important discussion. It's definitely a pleasure and honor for me to join. Thank you also.
Do you mind if I just interrupt briefly, because your video is off?
Oh, that's not good. It's on now.
Yes,
now
you're back. Good. Thank you.
Sorry for that. But anyway, thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Stefano, for your first remarks. There's a lot that you said. I think that I am a proud member, represents a proud member state of the European Union in the Team Europe approach. A lot have been done, and there's still lots to do in that field, but we are definitely on a good track, I think. Rosa, for your question, I think, I mean, of course, as in all other countries, there's a variety of different measures taken that makes up the Swedish approach. And I think actually, or honestly, that it's not very different from other countries. I mean, but what we have been able to avoid a complete lockdown, and we've been able to keep basic social services open. People have still been able to go to work. We have still our children are still in school, and these are things that we know are really good for health also, and makes our society continue on, even though we are, of course, having a great challenges in fighting the pandemic back and the virus. But all of these measures that have been taken they're built on a very positive social contract, I think, here in Sweden, where we put a lot of trust in citizens in following the recommendations that come from our public authorities. And so far, things are going fairly well, or well enough for us to still being able to avoid a lockdown, promoting or still protecting basic services, protecting fundamental rights, protecting these things that of course are also in the core of our values that we also put in our core in terms of international engagement or development cooperation or foreign policy at all. I mean, COVID-19, I think, is not. It's not just a health crisis. Evidently, it's a socioeconomic crisis. Very often in the developing world, we see also that the socioeconomic consequences precede the pandemic itself. So we have to fight the broken value chains, the broken economies, the pressure on health systems before we actually have to fight the pandemic in many contexts. But it's also a humanitarian crisis, of course, as we see with hunger on the rise and all of these other factors around the world. But it's also a rights crisis, and it's a crisis for democratic institutions. And as Stefano said, an infodemic that we also have to learn how to fight at the same time as we fight the pandemic itself. But I mean, if citizens that are not informed and that cannot inform themselves freely, how can they be involved in becoming a resilient citizen in fighting a pandemic? Of course, it's impossible. So these things come very much together. And we have in our international response tried to combine these two. I mean, of course, in partner countries around the world, we've reprogrammed our support to emphasize the health sector, not only in COVID-19 terms, but also to see all those other consequences of other parts of the health sector that is often hit women and girls the hardest, and where HIV, affected people cannot go to the hospital to get their medicine. There's not contraceptives. We know that violence against women are up by a third. 30% rise during the pandemic and so on. So we've also tried to program our support to also meet the challenges that comes as a consequence of the pandemic, but also reprogrammed to partner with radio channels, with journalists, with social media actors to make sure that there is a free information and that there is correct information out there so that citizens can involve themselves. There's a lot you need if you want to fight a pandemic for yourself. You need clean water, you need basic hygiene, but you also need information, and you need to be able to collect and discuss that information with your peers. And this is where these issues meet, I think. I mean, yes, and Stefano was mentioning that, Rosa, you mentioned it early on, that we've seen disproportionate measures, lockdowns, we've seen even more of a shrinking space for civil society actors. We've seen attacks on freedom of information, of press freedom. We've seen postponing of elections, and we can go on. And we have seen these measures without a clear path or a clear idea of how to roll these measures back as we fight the pandemic. And this, I think, is the most dangerous part here. Of course, you're allowed to take necessary measures to be able to fight the pandemic. But when they are disproportionate, and when you don't have a plan to roll them back, and with less opportunities to hold decision makers accountable, when there's less transparency involved, then you sort of created a situation where democracy is definitely on a backslide. But again, I think we have to remind ourselves, and I think this is a great forum just to stress it. We see a crisis for democracy primarily in the institutions of democracy. If we look around the world, we see people taking to the streets not only in Minsk, but in Beirut, in Santiago, in Bogota, in Tehran, in Khartoum last year, and the list goes on, with people demanding accountability, demanding transparency, demanding inclusiveness, participation, to make their voice heard, gender equality, and so on. So the values of democracy are not backsliding. They're on the rise. Young people all over the world demand more democracy. But we as decision makers, regimes, governments, institutions, we fail to meet these expectations. And this is where we have the crisis. And this is also, I think, where the backsliding happens when we are also hit by a pandemic, trying to meet the pandemic at the same time. So all of this we try to incorporate into our international response. It's part of the Swedish diplomacy. It's part of our drive for democracy that we launched last year, where we want to be even better at supporting institutions in meeting these demands that come from people, but also supporting people, freedom of assembly, journalists, freedom of expression, and so on. So, and I think it's possible. It's possible to make the world, to build back better, to build back greener, and that means also to build back more democratic. And I think we can do so. And I think the Team Europe approach, to finish up again, to finish where I started, is an excellent approach, because we see now that apart from Europe, the four biggest economies of the world, the US, Brazil, and India, they are now failing completely in terms of their handling their pandemic, and their economies are going to fall. And the fourth one is China, and that is a narrative that we don't want to leave the world alone with. There needs to be another narrative. There needs to be another partner for the world when building back better, and that partner needs to be Europe, and that needs to be the European institutions together with the member states.
Thank you very much, Per. I'd like to take your cue also for Arnold, because you mentioned that the coronavirus is a health crisis, a socioeconomic crisis, humanitarian crisis, a rights crisis, but some are securitizing it as well and exploiting the opportunity to promote emergency measures, curtail parliamentary involvement and oversight. And this, Anna, was precisely what you're working on, what your work is, engaging with other parliaments to find the best practices. Can you tell us a little bit more about your line of work and what you're doing as a Finnish organization in other countries, and what your challenges are?
Well, thank you, Rosa, and likewise, it's been an honor to be invited to this panel. Yes, Demo Finland, we mainly work with political parties in order to mainly recognize that they are really the key for resilient democracies. So we're supporting multi-party work in quite a few numbers of countries, few in Asia, few in Africa, but we also work in Finland. We also, of course, work with parliaments on parliamentary oversight, and one country I think that encapsulates all these threats that we've been mentioning earlier, thank you, Stefano and Per, is Sri Lanka. where we have been supporting multi-party dialogue with all the parliamentary parties' youth organizations earlier, as well as now we're starting multi-party work with the with the women's organizations, cross-party. So it's always cross-party what we do. Sri Lanka, unfortunately, encapsulates these trends that have been mentioned, the negative ones. No parliamentary oversight. The parliament was dissolved for 4 months. There were the elections early August. Freedom of information, civil society space all shrunk, and also undermining multilateralism. And I think that is a very big danger and an issue that we all need to tackle, Europe and EU as well. Sri Lanka has not been committed to the various UN resolutions on transitional justice, as well as reconciliation of the civil war. I'm pointing out in Sri Lanka, there are numerous other cases as well. An international rule-based order. And here I think EU should step up, despite that we have our own problems and no democracy is never ready or fulfilled. There always needs to be a lot of work to be done. Also countries like Sweden and Finland. But despite of that, when you look at the EU's basic values on human rights and democracy and such like, I think it's important to step up on the international arena. But also for the member states, such as Finland and indeed Sweden, I think there is a lot more to speak out on. There are good practices to be shared, from gender equality to consensus-based decision-making. Going back to Sri Lanka still, indeed, gender-based violence has been on rise there as elsewhere, and it's a very worrying trend during the lockdown and the movement restrictions and emergency legislation. And it would be interesting in the future to see research done. How did that affect on campaigning of women candidates? How did that affect of them standing up as candidates? Especially countries where there's a high prevalence of political violence to start with, then combine that with the domestic violence increase, and how does that affect the civil and political rights of minorities or underrepresented groups in politics? So these are the topics that we are trying to tackle as indeed a civil society organization. But Demo Finland is also an interesting example of multi-party cooperation, because I'm running a secretariat of all the parliamentary parties organizations. So we have all the nine parliamentary parties of Finnish Parliament on board, supporting democracy support. And one more thing I'd like to raise from a practitioner point of view is very important that the donors, whether it's a member state, EU, or a foundation, or what, are flexible with the funding at these times, also towards the democracy support organizations. There needs to be more flexibility to reshape our activities when needed. So this is something I'd like to call, and also to call, whether it's EU or member state or any other multilateral organization, is that in COVID action plans, whether it's Team Europe or member states own, that they would include, of course, emergency health measures. And Stefano, I think you went through quite a few of them, important ones. Economic recovery, but also support for democratic governance. This is very important, because Per, like you wisely put, that this is not only a health crisis, this is a socio-economic crisis, this is a crisis of democracy. So we need these holistic, multifaceted approaches in order to tackle, and also to look at what can come out of this renewing democracy, learning of the new ways of civil society movement, and there's been very innovative ways during the time of for instance, internet closures and digital surveillance. There are still very innovative ways how civil society has been managing to connect during this time. But despite of that, I really would like to call for more support on democratic governance, but also flexibility. But thank you. That's what I'd like to add at this point.
Rosa, can I come in just 1 second?
Right. I'm back. I disappeared for a while. So I'm terribly sorry about this. The internet just went. So let's go back to our discussion. What I'd like to focus on for the next few moments is this relationship between the support that is given to focusing on public health and the economic impacts of the virus, and what does this mean with respect to EU support for democracy around the world? I mean, can we expect, or a national support as well, can we expect that to remain stable? Or, we know that the financial stretch is limited. We know that Europe will be also focusing on its own internal recovery. So there's going to be a lot of competition for priorities. How can one make all this fit in nicely together? And maybe just to start, I thought the response to Belarus was actually, and maybe Stefano, you can say a few words about it. So the Commission mobilized immediately 53 million euros, 50 of which was for coronavirus related issues, and the 3 million to support civil society, to support the protesters, provide legal support, and all sorts of other tools that are absolutely necessary. But is there an idea that perhaps by focusing on the coronavirus, one is also addressing one of the shortcomings of the Belarusian government that did not respond well to the pandemic, which is one of the incentives for people to take to the streets? And what does this mean for democracy support more generally? Now, I've used Belarus as an example because it's, we're reading about it. The protests every Sunday are continuing. It's really quite extraordinary. But feel free also to refer to other countries. It's just finding the right balance between priorities, sometimes competing priorities, and making sure there's synergy between the objectives. How can one do that? And I'll start with, we'll keep the same order for now and then open it up to Q&A. And I hope not to have any more hiccups with my internet connection.
Thanks, Rosa. And maybe can I use the, I'd say before answering more directly your question, to make 2 points that I, in my presentation, I had missed. The first one concerns gender, and if I can broaden it's gender and the protection of most vulnerable groups, because I mean essentially we are speaking about, let's say, number of groups which, especially in certain societies, have a very difficult life. And again, I mean, it's the COVID-19 has exacerbated this trend and has made the things even worse. And I think that Per was rightly mentioning also the issue of domestic violence. So I mean, this is certainly one very important element that so we will. It's part of our reflection on Team Europe initiatives. And the other one concerned the support to democratic governance. The point of governance of, let's say, trying to boost development that are inclusive, human-centric, and human rights-based is very much present in all our work. And I would say that the governance issue is one element which is, let's say, underneath and basic and for all the actions that we are taking. So just to stress these 2 points that I had missed to mention in my first intervention. Concerning your question, Rosa, yeah, it is true that I would say Belarus, I would say, is a little bit of a specific case in the sense that there was a quite substantial amount of money which had been devoted to assist, let's say, Belarus, like all the countries of the Eastern Partnership, from the in the context of the Team Europe initiative. So that stays, and I think I'd say it has to stay because this is it's a very important support that we are giving in order to help the population to overcome this specific problem. We are also trying to, let's say, to support the civil society, and we're trying to support, let's say, parties and help them. we need to do it carefully, because I mean, unfortunately, the narrative built from the Belarusian authority over the European assistance and support is making that even the parties and the NGOs themselves are quite reluctant to be seen as receiving money from the European Union. They want to still to make it clear that it is a genuine internal movement that is not, pushed or generated from outside. Is a genuine reaction to what it is a clear, let's say, violation of the political rights in the country. And then, let's say, we have seen also, let's say, following this, also the violation of human rights that are taking now place. But in general terms, I think that there is certainly for us, it is very important to support, let's say, as I was saying before, the governance element, the human rights dimension, the civil rights dimension, and we are trying to, to take this element into account both explicitly but also implicitly. I mean, it's just to mention one of the projects on which we are working now, which is a project on cacao in Côte d'Ivoire. The initiative, sorry, it's not a private initiative that we want to develop under the Team Europe, let's say, envelope. This is very much also taking into account children's rights, child labor, and the need to avoid that, let's say, again, the most fragile and vulnerable groups of the society could be let's say, exploited, and how to avoid this and how to change this pattern, how to move it into a positive, let's say, positive circle, which is helping and supporting rather than generating more problems.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Per and Anu, can I get you also to comment on this question before we open up to the audience? And just to remind everyone, you can post questions on the YouTube chat line or on Twitter on Carnegie's handle, which is @CarnegieEurope, using the hashtag Democracy Week 2020. So Per and Anu, I'd like to bring you in on this sort of, how can we put together these competing objectives and prioritize and be sensitive, locally sensitive as well. And also the gender issue, actually. I mean, Sweden is the country has promoted feminist foreign policy. Maybe you also have something to comment on this. So, Per, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosa. And again, thank you, Stefano, for that comment. I think it was Anu who mentioned it in her previous statement, that this response needs to be holistic, because we can't program a response just focusing, narrowing down on health without taking into account vulnerable groups, the right to information, the freedom of movement, the freedom of assembly, and then we are again programming. Then we are directly programming also rights and democracy, response. So this all comes together, and I think the problem comes if we think we can program a response that is just a health response or just a rights response. And so far, I think in the Team Europe approach, we've been able to have to bring this holistic approach on. Then, what different member states do and what different actors do on the ground, they can be focused and they can be more narrow in their own response. But we have to, at the decision-making level, of course, keep this holistic response. And I think it's definitely important. Otherwise, we also lose an opportunity, because when talking and involving in a discussion on building back better, on economic recovery, we have to take this opportunity. A crisis is always also an opportunity, as someone sometime somewhere said. I mean, to make sure the economy comes back fossil free, to make sure that we come back more gender equal, more inclusive, and so on. I mean, Another example that is not Belarus, that is Uganda. We've seen now that they have not postponed their elections, or they are about to have their election, and the government party has the right to hold public meetings, but the opposition has not been able to have their public meetings because of COVID. So again, public authorities, playing out the COVID card as a reason to shut down the opposition. And of course, we have to, when supporting Uganda in their response to the pandemic, or in their very generous response to a refugee crisis in East Africa, we also have to take that opportunity to discuss with them on how to proceed towards their election, to make sure that the opposition has a right to become and be an opposition and take part in the coming election. I think, and this is of course very complex, and you have to be very careful when programming the support. And Belarus is the perfect example for this, as Stefano said. If we would be loud and clear about what groups we are involved with, or what different parties and organizations receive support in how they do that, they would not be able to operate anymore. So this is complex indeed, but economic support or development cooperation, be it from a member state, from another actor, or from the European Union, also comes with an arena for conversation. And we don't give development assistance just to get that arena for conversation, but that conversation still comes with it, and we need to take that opportunity also to raise issues on democracy, on gender equality, on human rights, and so on. So it comes hand in hand, and that's why I think the pandemic is a crisis, is a multiple crisis, but it's also an opportunity, and therefore a multiple opportunity. And we have to see it that way, because otherwise we would completely lose hope at this point. But people are taking to the streets all over the world, and they demand a different tomorrow. And I've said before, and I think that our chance, or our ability to fight this pandemic and its crisis that comes with it, doesn't depend on what we know today, but from what we can imagine for tomorrow. And these people that are now out demanding another tomorrow, they have already imagined a different tomorrow. And it is now our obligation to build back better, to help them fight, or help them, create that tomorrow for themselves. And that's what we can do. And this is what we want to do also in development cooperation. And again, as Stefano was mentioning, I mean, the pandemic is the perfect example for why a single country cannot deal on its own. You can't fight the pandemic on your own, but you can't fight climate crisis on your own either. And you can't fight an authoritative narrative on your own either. So we need to cooperate more, and we need more global cooperation, and therefore we need multilateralism. And therefore, again, the pandemic is also an opportunity for multilateralism. If we can come out of this with actors as the EU, as the UN, as the OSCE and other actors to be more relevant, to be more up to speed, to be more fit for purpose, then we can deliver something. I think we've done a great deal for tomorrow's generation, that we have more stable multilateral institutions that have the support and trust of people, and that can deliver on the ground for a better tomorrow. So it comes together, but it is very complex and it's very difficult. And again, I think actors who have the most trustworthy partnerships locally, be it in Minsk or in Kampala or anywhere else, those institutions will be most successful in programming a holistic support that fits its purpose most.
Thank you very much, Per. Anu.
Well, I think when it comes to Belarus, there is a definite need to stop using violence and release all the unlawfully arrested people. The arbitrary arrests need to stop. Also, I'm a strong believer in a dialogue. National dialogue is the key out of this situation, including Lukashenko, civil society, and also opposition. How and when, but that is the key. The other option that's been offered is a constitutional changes and elections later on. That is too little and too late, to my personal view. And I think it's a time to remind also countries like Belarus of their international commitments, such as the Eastern Partnership with EU, that brings also commitments and responsibilities, such as the commitment to rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And at the moment, the situation in Belarus is such that those commitments are not followed. So when democracy support actors are considered to be supported, indeed, I mean, there are very many small-scale grassroots actors also who may fall out of radar of a bigger donors. So there needs to be found a way to channel the support for such local actors who know very well the local context, obviously. But I'm sure we can find those in all of the countries that had now a big crackdown on the civil society. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions coming in. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read 3 now, and I'll ask you to sort of pick and choose. And also invite you, if you have anything you'd like to comment, to things that other speakers said, please feel free to do that. So first I'll bunch of 3 questions that are also looking at different areas and regions of the world. And then maybe for the final round, a little bit more forward looking, like how do we prepare for the next pandemic? So in terms of, so what the audience would like to hear more about experiences in Africa with respect to democracy, and what kind of EU and what kind of international support is being given towards that part of the world. Also a question about, it specifically refers to Pakistan, but it's kind of for lower middle income economies, which, as we know, haven't been the first beneficiaries of the international of the IMF plans, of the G7 plans. They haven't been, because that was really for the lower income countries. So the lower to middle income economies have been badly hit. And one of our listeners refers to Pakistan. The confusion around these policies and the growing income disparity and poverty can shake people's confidence in nascent democracies. So how are international donors working with young democracies to counter the coronavirus? And then another question from Georgina Turner from the EPA platform about slightly a sort of parallel but equally important area, and that is the area of culture and how to support employment in culture, creativity and entrepreneurialism around the world, including post-pandemic. So I'd suggest you pick and choose, depending to where you feel most comfortable. Africa, low to middle income countries, the role of culture. We've talked a lot about civil society and local actors. So I think each of you can maybe contribute to these questions, and then we'll move on to a final round on the on looking forward, and that will also enable me to plug the recommendations of the report that we've just put out. So shall we start with you, Stefano, or shall we follow the same order?
Okay, maybe before one comment, because I think that both Per and Anu were referring to a very interesting element when it comes to Belarus and the connection with the Eastern Partnership. And I think that they are right in stressing that, because it's one of the things that we need to think a little bit harder on how to involve more also the actors from the region into this. I mean, I don't want to speak about peer pressure because it's complicated, but in a way it's interesting, and there is something that we are giving some thought on how, without, let's say, creating problems, but how the countries of the Eastern Partnership could help also in managing this crisis. When it comes to your question, maybe and sorry, one other element always on the Eastern Partnership about the need to think also on how we can use the instrument of the approximation to the internal market and their integration into the internal market in order to let's say, support the countries of the region and generate different conditions for the future. Turning to Africa and experiences in Africa, and which is the kind of support that has been given. I mean, there are honestly a number of things that have already that have been done, which goes from the support to small and medium enterprises to the protection of social systems, program of transfer of cash for social objectives, strengthening the delivery of public services. So there is a very large number of initiatives that have been taken in that perspective, apart the, let's say, the more classical support, like humanitarian assistance, vital medical equipment, and humanitarian staff. But let's say we have tried also to look at more specifically in how to reduce and mitigate the social impact of the crisis. And I mean, now the next step is what I was very much referring to before, looking at the areas like green, like digital, like data technologies, like the sustainable growth, partnerships, also to, let's say, in relation with the migration problems, governance that I mentioned before, gender and participation of women in decision processes, and more in general, peace and security. So let's say the horizon is very large, and is really covering a number of different initiatives. And again, even when I look now very briefly at the flagship initiatives that we want to take, I see that there are a number. One I mentioned already about cocoa, but I mean, sustainable cities, e-youth and projects in order to facilitate e-education in these countries, renewable energies, the digitalization. So there is a very huge array of different initiatives that have been taken in the African countries. And again, I mean, it's now we have a number of important also appointments in front of us, because on the 28th of September there will be a meeting of the foreign ministers of the European Union with the African Union. It is very likely now that the summit will be postponed to somewhere next year, because I mean it's very difficult to have it physical. But there will be a meeting between the let's say the European institutions with the heads of the regional institutions in Africa, exactly to have a common ground on the way forward, and how we can shape up a partnership, a better partnership between EU and Africa.
Thank you, Stefano. So, Per, would you like to contribute as well? And just to remind you also of Africa, which Stefano was also mentioning, and also the low to middle income countries. So, and yeah, role of culture. So, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa. You also asked me before if I wanted to say something about the fact that we have a feminist foreign policy, and if that affects, our response in the pandemic, or the way we see or assess the situation. And I mean, of course, it does. With the feminist foreign policy, we will consequently underline the consequences of this pandemic to girls and women worldwide. We will seek ways to mitigate or try to improve circumstances around girls and women and how they are affected by the pandemic. And we'll try to mobilize support and also get other actors and countries and donors to act on that as what we see. And we have seen, and it has been mentioned before during this seminar, but we say, I mean, not only sexual and gender-based violence, but we see also, numbers going the wrong way in terms of female genital mutilation, early or forced marriages, violence, and so on. And of course, when you start seeing that, and if you make it your thing to always put resources, rights, and representations of girls and women on the table, whatever you do, it becomes very evident that was a priority that we had before, but the pandemic has shown us that it's even more important now, and that we need to mobilize even greater support for such an agenda now, and so on and so forth. I think the three very well put questions. When we have, I mentioned Uganda before and the way we try to operate there. We have also increased our support in Sudan and Ethiopia to try to step in and support those positive trends that we've seen in those countries. Now, of course, too early to say or to call if that is or will be a success in either of those countries. But if we don't take the opportunity or we seize the moment and step in and try to give the support right now, then who are we to call on them later on? So we're doing our best there. At the same time, Sweden has in our bilateral relation, we have lowered severely our support to Tanzania, for example, because we see that the economic or the democratic processes there are going backwards, going the wrong direction. So we have moved out of supporting public institutions, and we have mobilized our support to non-governmental actors instead. Keeping the same type of priorities, of course, but sometimes you have to draw a line, and you can't involve in a partnership with a public authority when you know that public authority is no longer an authority to count on in terms of your democratic values, for example. So it's back and forth, but we need to be more active on this, and we need to show and give support, and there are many more, of course, reasons to do so in Africa. And I think also in the upcoming EU-Africa strategy, which is quite focused also on investments and these things. Africa is desperate for foreign investments, and we need to make sure that those investments come also with a call for transparency, anti-corruption, and so on. That is the only way forward if we want European actors to involve in Africa with economic investments. They need to respond also with transparency, and there lies a ground to talk about democracy also in other terms. In lower middle income countries, I think we've seen the biggest or the great role that our IFIs can play. I mean, the international financial institutions, but they also need to update, of course, their demands. If they are going to come with loans or very with grants of different kinds, we need to move away maybe from the Chicago economics and more to the Paris Treaty as an instrument to look at and to roll back disproportionate anti-democratic measures, for example, could or maybe should be also a must if you want to receive those grants and if you want to receive those loans to build back your economy better. And so I think the World Bank or the IMF does not have democracy in their constituency to work with, but they have good governance. And now I think it's the time to be very clear on that. So that, of course, we have an obligation to help these countries recover. But again, it's an opportunity for us to make sure that they recover and build back better and more inclusive and democratic. I mean, to me, and it is also a central part of our drive for democracy. Culture, creativity, and the arts are it's the last grasp of oxygen we have in the world when everything else closes down. And as I said before, it's not about what we know for today, but what we can imagine for tomorrow. And who helps us imagine? Well, those are the artists, those are the creators. And I think we need to embed the creative sector, the cultural sector, into our democratic response. So when we talk about the freedom of the press, we definitely need to talk about the freedom of culture, because we see that it is those producers at national theaters or arts halls that are also, their space is also shrank. So that is also a space that we need to protect and help expand. So when we talk about democracy, when we talk about democratic responses, we need also to include the arts in there, definitely. And we do so now in our drive for democracy, and I'm very happy for that.
Thank you very much, Per. Anu.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll also tap on to African continent, but also linking that way to the lower and middle income countries that you have quite a few on the northern part especially. I think African Union is also having a key role in this. It stepped up its coordination regarding coronavirus and setting up a Corona Fund and so on. So now for the institution that's importance is growing all the time, it has a great chance to also step up its commitment to human rights and democracy on the continent. And this is something that I can see EU and AU can possibly work together even stronger and can. I mean, there are already mechanisms for that. EU and AU human rights dialogue to start with. So I think post-pandemic, we need to make an efficient use of already existing mechanisms and transform and reform them as seen fit of all the information that gathered during pandemic. And one way to keep on track what's going on in given countries is to track the democratic deficit. And there's a couple of organizations, International IDEA, as well as Westminster Foundation for Democracy, who made these trackers on democracy deficit during the pandemic. So, and I think it's in your paper, Rosa, also is one of the recommendations to come up with a more global tracker. And I think that's a wonderful idea. What comes to a practitioner like us who does more or less local level, even grassroots democracy support, of course, our kind of work is very context-based, tailor-made for a context needs. So, but for us, for instance, inclusivity and underrepresented groups in politics, such as youth and women, their role and enhancement and the civil and political rights of those groups and individuals is a key. And that is something that also I'm sure will be useful is these sharing good practices, whether it is indeed the women leadership of the countries that have done really well, it is clearly. And we can see that more inclusive decision making makes better decisions. And according to research, if you have more women in leadership positions, you have better social and health policies. And here we go. So that is definitely something to support on any given country is to also follow then the sustainable development goals, where there are various commitments, but not to also forget the human rights conventions. So we have a lot of instruments. Now we just need to put them in use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to the final question, which is about how international actors prepare to preserve civil liberties and democratic rule of law around the world, but for future times, for future pandemics, or even for global disasters. And I think it's sort of a bit of a platitude to say that we're always prepared for the past crisis and not for the next one. And that is one of the recommendations in the report, the report co-written by my colleague Richard Youngs and Elene Pantrulidze, but led through a process led by the European Endowment for Democracy, is one of the recommendations is really to work on foresight. And now we even have a commissioner at the EU for foresight. So what is it that can be done to make sure that we really are better prepared the next time? And we've all known that the pandemic was a known unknown. It was, in the scientific community, it was known that it was going to happen. And of course, there've been a few recently, and in Africa, including in Africa, but we didn't know when and how and under what shape. So how can we prepare? Shall I just invert the order and start with Anu first?
Thank you, Rosa. It's a very important point, how to learn from this. And we definitely know there are a lot of global crises looming in the horizon, and starting from climate change. I would really like to see a stepped up cooperation and quick decision making regarding climate change, as we see with the COVID-19 at the moment. That is a burning issue, a literal sense as well. And how is that linking up to democracy? How do we deal with the climate change when we have the electoral periods, certain year lengths, and are the decision makers willing to commit for decades-long policies? I mean, these are issues that I think need to be tempered. One thing that we've not tapped into yet so much is disinformation. And I think whatever pandemic or crisis looms, there needs to be more stepped up actions on that. EU has come up with a couple of good initiatives, such as the code of practice for the big companies. And I think the clear message for them is that the self-regulation time is over, and that doesn't work. So there is a definite lesson to learn and look into how we can tackle it, because while increased use of social media is a good tool, at the time, let's say political campaigning, where you can't physically travel and meet your electorate, many countries in Myanmar at the moment, again, social media is becoming a stronger tool in election campaigning, as even maybe before the previous election. And what does that mean? And what there needs to be done, whether we talk about disinformation spread in Europe, where we also have that, as well as in the countries where you may have basic human rights unfilled, such as right to education and low level of literacy. How to step up on the civic education and media literacy. I see it also the need for that in Finland, not to then mention another country. So these are my 50 cents, so to say.
Per.
Thank you, and I think I couldn't agree more with Anu. I think she's spot on in her description of what's needed. I think what comes to my mind is the word resilience. We now need to come together to build resilience. We need to build resilience in our own countries, in our partner countries, and we need to build resilience as a multilateral or as one global society. And this, of course, this resilience needs to be everywhere, wherever it is, need to be built on local knowledge, and therefore to have a local ownership. And therefore, of course, we need to involve people, more inclusive, in the building of that resilience, and therefore in the building of building back better, or therefore in the building of these societies. And we need to do so by strengthening, of course, national health systems, national education systems, but also the national democratic institutions that can gain the trust of people, but can also work for its people in a better way. I mean, it's about investing in people's health, but definitely also in the health of the planet. We know that climate crisis will just make sure that pandemic comes more often. So if we fight the pandemic without fighting climate change, we can just grab a ticket and sit and wait until the pandemic comes next time. So investing in climate change or in the work against climate change, investing in biodiversity and the restoration of ecosystems to make sure that our planet is healthy, then we can also have more healthy people. So it's one health in a way, and I think that is a perspective that we need to bring with us. But we also need to invest in people's free, open, transparent, and democratic participation in the resilience building. And I think that is a way to be better prepared next time. If we trust each other more, if we can cooperate more, then we are better prepared when the pandemic hits next time it arrives. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano.
Wait. Again, just one last perspective, and I think this feeds right into what Stefano has to say. I think that we need to do this in a way that we can regain trust for the multilateral institutions. And when we act on this, we need to also strengthen the ability of our multilaterals, both in a policy making way, but definitely in the operational way. So to prepare better for the next pandemic is to move a great multilateral cooperation away from headquarters in Brussels, in Geneva, in New York, in wherever it is, and move it from headquarters into the field. So we need to get our multilateral cooperation to work in the field. And when we do so, we will be much better prepared for whatever comes. Now I'm ready. Thank you.
Stefano.
No, very much in line with what Per and Anno were saying. I think that the two keywords are multilateralism on the one hand and resilience on the other. I mean, it's resilience. We are trying to now to let's say to develop a little bit more the concept and move from resilience to strategic autonomy. But maybe I can expand a little bit on the two. I think that Per is right in mentioning that in the multilateral aspect, let's say the openness and the cooperation must remain at the core of our international action. And I mean, this is a mutually beneficial partnership. It's not just for in terms of generosity. It's something that is important for everybody. I think that we cannot speak about our security from all points of view. I'm not saying about only speaking about defense, but in general about the security of our continent if we do not have security all around us. So I mean that was the basis of the multilateralism, and it continues to be, let's say, the basis for our action. From that point of view, I think that one effort that we need to make is really very much to strengthen and expand our partnerships. Per was mentioning the need to go beyond, let's say, the Geneva, New York, or Brussels, and to go much more wider. I think that he's right in saying so. Partnership have really to become, let's say, an instrument that we can use locally in our action. It's a little bit also the logic of the Team Europe initiatives. It's very much that of bringing together not only EU institutions, but we have also the ambition to be attractive also for others, for international financial institutions and other actors. In this, it is important that we sharpen our tools and also increase our unity of actions and the coherence of our action. This is a crucial point because when it comes to, let's say, facing difficult choices, it's only our unity that makes it possible to get it done, and not to let's say be subject of the competition that is now characterizing the relations between US and China. And the second point is that the resilience, or again, of the strategic autonomy, which is for me, let's say, a very fundamental aspect of the work that we are all doing, but also the DIS is doing at this stage. We need to identify our vulnerabilities. We need to understand which are the critical points that are that we have in our system. I mean, now we speak a lot about supply chains, but it's not only about this. It's really to see which are the elements of, let's say, of weakness within our systems, and to work in order to reduce this vulnerability, be it in the economy, in the trade, in the strategic sectors, in connectivity, in the artificial intelligence. I mean, you just name it. In all this area, we do need to be sure that, again, this does not mean to repatriate things, to let's say, to bring back to Europe productions, but we need to be able to put it bluntly, not to depend only on one country for issues like, I don't know, masks or paracetamol. I mean, this is something that we really need to look at very carefully. And there is an effort that now the European Union is doing in order to make a mapping of these vulnerabilities, and on the basis of that, then take a decision on how to, let's say, to avoid to become subject of the problems that we have experienced during the COVID crisis. And again, I mean, from that point of view, this is not only, it has to start from home, so it has to start from Europe, but clearly has to, let's say, look at around us, to all our partners, because again, there is no, even from this point of view, there is no security, and if we cannot work together with the others, and that's why also the issue of the strategic autonomy is very much linked to multilateralism and to the idea that we need to play in a world which is based on agreed rules, and that cannot be just a sort of battlefield where the strongest has the last word in the fight.
Thank you, Stefano. I'm going to take advantage of your time because I just got a little question from Robert Cooper, and I'd like you to answer in just a few syllables, but I think it's a nice question. And it refers to what you were just saying about starting from home. And Robert Cooper is asking, could you tell us about the threats to democracy in the countries you know best, i.e. your own countries or the country you live in? I think it's a nice complement to the whole discussion on international support. What is happening in our own societies? And Anu, I'd like to start from you because at the end of your remarks, you made a reference to education and social media. So maybe, I don't know, maybe your answer is already in those words, but please.
I've not seen enough of work in Finland on media literacy. I did see a study a while back, and it stated that in Finland, it's generally the senior citizens that are lacking the media literacy skills. So that is definitely an issue. Another thing that is crucial working with political parties is that they need to keep making themselves important here, renewing the practices, and it is tricky how to reach out to people where there are so many competing factors competing over the people's leisure time. And whereas there's no other entities that can take the place of the political parties. And final point, age membership of the parties, which I think is a typical phenomenon in numerous countries, as well as having more underrepresented groups on board. So those are the ones that come to mind immediately. But there is a lot to do, and even our gender equality is not ready here. And I'm sure also Per, you guys use in Sweden, because our countries are often as the great examples. But a lot of domestic violence here, for instance.
I think, I mean, I think in the Nordic countries, we see a more fragmented society than before, and we have definitely challenges in terms of, Anu put it as media literacy, but with news and facts used for propaganda, not for information, and this is something where we need to be better. And I think we see in our countries, as in many other countries, that those forces who seek a more authoritarian future are much better at using digitalization or the internet for their cause than what we have been, who seek a more open, transparent, and democratic future. And I think this is a threat to democracy everywhere, and it definitely is a threat to democracy in Europe. And it's one reason why we need to be so much involved, for example, in the Eastern Partnership or the Southern Partnership work that we have. So I would also mentioning this. And of course, I think transparency in terms of global response to democracy, the lack of transparency and the corruption which is This is definitely, everywhere, and makes it very difficult for any type of response, be it economic or democratic.
Thank you. And Stefano, can you identify something for Italy?
Yeah, I think that it's, I don't know if for Italy or for Europe, and maybe in general. I mean, I think that I would say for me, the main threat at this stage is the polarization. The polarization, which is, I would say, has now become the norm in our society. Politically, you have enemies. So essentially, I mean, you do not have a space where, let's say, as it used to be before, government and opposition could agree on a number of things and could move forward in a sort of national agenda. Polarization socially, either you are, let's say, you think like me, or if you don't think like me, there is no space for you. There is no space for what is different from you. What is no space for, say, whatever is not in line with my way of thinking and my form of living and my form of behaving. And also polarization economically, where we see the divide, which is growing bigger and bigger, with very little, let's say, capacity to mitigate this divide. So for me, this is really the, let's say, if I have to capture in a sort of nutshell, the trend which worries me most, because this is generating, let's say, a very a division in society that is very difficult to overcome, because nobody wants to take also into account also the point of view of someone else, and that's, I'd say, a real threat to democracy.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you, Anu. Thank you, Per. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great discussion. Let me also thank the audience and all the partners who are engaged in the Democracy Week 2020. I hope many of you will be tuning into other events. Let me just take this opportunity to thank my colleague Maria Kuman, who you haven't seen her, but she has actually organized this event and the work of Carnegie on governance and democracy, and has done so with great enthusiasm, with professionalism. So thank you very much, Maria. We really appreciate your work. And with this, I bring this discussion to an end. Thank you for staying tuned in, and I look forward to meeting you online or in person, depending on the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.